Sometimes the loneliest souls live in the biggest bodies, carrying pain that no one else can see. In the wild mountains of Colorado Territory, Silas Kane stood 7 feet tall and lived completely alone, feared by everyone who knew his name. For 15 years, he had been called a monster, a beast, a man to avoid at all costs. Then one day, a blind bride named Sarah stumbled into his world. She had lost her sight to fever, but when she reached out and touched his face, she saw something no one else ever had. She saw the broken man hiding behind the giant. What happened next would change both their lives forever. But could love really heal a heart that had been hurt for so long? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the peaks of the Colorado Rockies like a shroud, wrapping around the cabin that sat perched on a ledge 8,000 feet above the world below. Inside that rough-hewn sanctuary, Silas Kane moved with the careful grace of a man who had learned to live with his own strength. At 7 feet and 2 inches tall, with shoulders that could span a doorway and hands that could crush stone, he had spent the last 15 years of his life ensuring that no living soul would ever have cause to fear those hands again. The cabin itself told the story of a man who had built his life from nothing but determination and solitude. Every log had been cut and placed by his own hands, every stone in the fireplace carefully selected from the mountain itself. The furniture, though simple, bore the marks of careful craftsmanship. Smooth surfaces worn by years of use, joints fitted with the precision of a man who had nothing but time to make things right. A hand-carved wooden cross sat on the mantel, polished smooth by handling, but never displayed prominently, as if he weren't quite ready to claim the faith it represented. Silas had not always been a hermit. There was a time when the people of Cedar Falls had looked up to him, literally and figuratively. Sheriff Kane, they had called him then, and children would wave from behind their mothers' skirts when he walked down Main Street. His badge had meant something in those days: justice, protection, hope, but that was before the night that changed everything, before the fire that took his wife Martha and their unborn child, before the accusations that drove him from the only home he had ever known. The town of Cedar Falls lay in the valley below, a collection of wooden buildings and dusty streets that had grown up around the silver mine. From his cabin, Silas could see the smoke rising from chimneys on clear days, could watch the tiny figures of people going about their daily lives. Sometimes, when the wind was right, he could even hear the church bells on Sunday morning. But for 15 years, he had been nothing more than a legend to those people, the giant of the mountain, the beast who lived in the peaks, the monster, who would steal children if they wandered too far from town. The truth was simpler and more painful. He was just a man who had lost everything that mattered and had chosen solitude over the risk of losing again. He rose with the sun each morning, tended his small garden, chopped wood for the winter, and read by firelight from the books he had salvaged from his old life. The Bible sat on his table, though he struggled daily with questions of faith and forgiveness. How could a just God allow such suffering? How could he forgive those who had destroyed his family and his reputation? The wooden cross on his mantle remained his only answer, carved in the early days of his exile, when grief was fresh and hope still flickered in his chest. 300 miles to the east, Sarah Elizabeth Morrison sat in the back of a covered wagon, her world reduced to the sounds and smells around her. The fever had taken her sight 6 months ago, leaving her dependent on others in ways that chafed against her independent spirit. At 24, she had planned to be a teacher, to make her own way in the world with her education and determination. Instead, she found herself traveling west as a mail-order bride to a man she had never met, arranged by an uncle who saw her blindness as a burden to be passed along to someone else. The letter from Harold Whitmore had been filled with promises: a comfortable home, financial security, children to love and care for. What it hadn't mentioned was that Harold Whitmore was twice her age, had buried 2 wives already, and was more interested in acquiring a housekeeper than a companion. Sarah had learned these details only after the arrangements had been made, and her train ticket purchased. By then, her uncle had made it clear that she was no longer welcome in his home, that a blind woman was too much responsibility for a man with his own family to consider. The wagon hit another rut, jolting Sarah. From her thoughts, she could smell the pine trees and mountain air, could feel the change in temperature as they climbed higher into the Colorado territory. The other passengers, a family heading to Denver, a traveling salesman, and an elderly woman going to live with her son, had been kind enough during the journey, but she could sense their discomfort around her condition. They spoke to her in the overly loud, simple tones people used with children or those they considered unable to understand. "Mountain storm coming," the driver called back to them. "Going to be a rough one. We'll push through Copper Creek Pass if we can, but might have to shelter for the night." Sarah pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and listened to the increasing wind. She had grown to read the world through sound and feeling since losing her sight. The whisper of wind through pine needles was different from its passage through aspens. The creak of wagon wheels on loose gravel had a different pitch than on packed earth. Right now, the wind carried the scent of snow and the promise of a storm that would be fierce even for these mountains. She fingered the simple, gold wedding ring her uncle had given her for the marriage, a plain band that had belonged to her grandmother. In her small traveling bag, she carried her most precious possessions, her mother's Bible, a daguerreotype of her parents she could no longer see but treasured anyway, and the few books written in the raised letters she had learned to read by. Touch, everything else she owned could be replaced. Everything else was just things. The storm hit with the sudden violence that mountain weather was known for. One moment the wagon was rolling steadily upward through the pass. The next they were being lashed by wind and sleet that turned the narrow trail treacherous. The horses whinnied in fear, their hooves slipping on rocks made slick by the sudden precipitation. "Hold on!" the driver shouted, but his words were nearly lost in the howling wind. Sarah felt the wagon lurch sideways, heard the terrible sound of splintering wood, and then the world turned upside down. The last thing she remembered was the sensation of flying through the air, her hands reaching out for something, anything, to break her fall. Then darkness claimed her, a darkness deeper than the blindness she had learned to navigate, pulling her down into unconsciousness as the storm raged on around the wreckage scattered across the mountainside. Far above, in his cabin that had weathered 100 such storms, Silas Kane stood at his window and watched the lightning illuminate the peaks. Something was different about this storm, something that made him restless in a way he hadn't felt in years. He'd learned to trust his instincts during his years as a lawman, and right now those instincts were telling him that this night would change everything. Outside, the wind howled like a living thing, and somewhere in its voice he thought he heard the sound of destiny calling his name. Dawn broke grey and cold over the mountains, the storm having passed but leaving devastation in its wake. Silas had barely slept, the restless feeling from the night before keeping him alert and pacing. His small cabin. As the first light filtered through the pines, he pulled on his heavy coat and stepped outside to survey any damage to his property. The air was thin and sharp, carrying the clean scent of snow and pine. His boots crunched through the light dusting of snow as he walked the perimeter of his homestead, checking the roof, the small barn where he kept his horse, and the path that led down the mountain. Everything seemed intact until he reached the eastern edge of his property, where the trail curved around a stand of aspens. There, scattered across the rocky ground, were pieces of a wagon, splintered wood, torn canvas, and personal belongings, scattered by the wind. His heart began to pound as he realized what he was seeing. The stagecoach that ran between towns must have been caught in the storm, and from the look of the wreckage, it had been a violent crash. Silas moved carefully through the debris, his trained eye taking inventory. There were signs that people had survived the initial crash, footprints in the soft earth, items gathered rather than randomly scattered. But as he followed the trail, he found something that made his blood run cold. At the base of a large boulder, partially hidden by fallen branches, lay a still form in a torn blue dress. For a moment he hesitated. 15 years of isolation had not been chosen lightly. Every interaction with another human being was a risk, a chance for his carefully built walls to crumble. But as he looked at the motionless figure, his conscience won the battle his fear had been fighting. Whatever else he had become, he had once taken an oath to protect and serve, and that part of him still lived beneath the layers of pain and self-imposed exile. The woman was unconscious but breathing, her dark hair matted with blood from a head wound. She was young, perhaps in her 20s, with a face that spoke of strength even in unconsciousness. But it was her eyes that stopped him cold. When he knelt beside her, they were open but unseeing, moving without focus, and he realized she was blind. A simple gold wedding ring caught the morning light on her left hand, and nearby lay a small traveling bag with her belongings scattered around it. As he lifted her carefully into his arms, she stirred slightly, her hand moving instinctively toward his face. Her fingers touched his cheek with surprising gentleness, and for a moment that felt like eternity, Silas experienced something he had not felt in 15 years, human touch given without fear or revulsion. Her hand was small and soft against his weathered skin, and when she whispered, "Help me," in a voice barely above a breath, something inside his chest cracked open, like ice breaking up on a spring river. The walk back to his cabin was the longest. Quarter-mile of his life. The woman was light in his arms, but the weight of decision bore down on him with each step. He could tend her wounds, make sure she was safe, and then guide her down to Cedar Falls where she belonged. That would be the smart thing, the safe thing. But as she unconsciously turned toward the warmth of his body, her head resting against his shoulder with complete trust, he found himself hoping the journey would take longer. Inside the cabin, he laid her gently on his own bed, the only proper place for someone injured. The head wound was not as serious as it had first appeared, but she had other injuries, bruised ribs, a twisted ankle, cuts and scrapes from her fall. As he cleaned her wounds with the careful attention he had once given to injured animals, she drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes murmuring words he couldn't quite catch. It was nearly noon when she finally woke fully, her unseeing eyes opening wide as consciousness returned. Silas was across the room, stirring a pot of soup over the fire, but he saw her instant of panic as she realized she was in an unfamiliar place. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice stronger now, but still cautious. Silas set down his ladle and turned to face her, though he knew she couldn't see him. For a moment he struggled with how to answer. The truth would likely terrify her. She was in the cabin of the man the whole territory called a monster. But lies had never come easily to him. "You're safe," he said finally, his voice rusty from disuse. "There was an accident. Your wagon went off the trail in the storm." She sat up slowly, wincing as her injuries made themselves known. Her hands moved carefully over the bed, taking inventory of her surroundings through touch. The others? The family with the children, Mrs. Henderson, Mr. Morrison the salesman. "I found tracks leading down the mountain. They made it out, headed for town. You were separated from them in the crash." Relief flooded her face, and she closed her eyes briefly. "Thank God. I was so worried." She paused, tilting her head as if studying him through sound alone. "You have a kind voice. May I ask your name?" The question hit him like a physical blow. His name was legend in these parts, but not the kind of legend that brought comfort to lost travelers. For a wild moment, he considered lying, giving her some other name that wouldn't carry the weight of 15 years of fear and superstition. But looking at her sitting in his bed, vulnerable and trusting, he found he couldn't add deception to everything else. "Silas," he said simply. "Silas Kane." She was quiet for a long moment, and he watched her face for signs of recognition. For the fear that would inevitably come when she realized who had found her. But instead of fear, he saw something that looked almost like relief. "The mountain man," she said softly. "I've heard the stories, but you don't sound like a monster to me." Her words hung in the air between them, challenging everything he had come to believe about himself and his place in the world. When people in Cedar Falls told stories about Silas Cain, they spoke of a giant who could tear a man apart with his bare hands, a beast who lived wild in the mountains and emerged only to terrorize the innocent. They didn't speak of a man who carved wooden crosses, or read by firelight, or tended injuries with gentle hands. "You should be afraid," he said, more to himself than to her. She turned toward the sound of his voice, and though her eyes couldn't find his, it felt as if she was looking directly into his soul. "I lost my sight to fever 6 months ago. Since then I've learned to see people differently than I used to. Fear has a sound, a feeling. Kindness does too. Right now, all I hear from you is kindness." As she spoke, she worked the wedding ring off her finger with deliberate motions, setting it on the table beside the bed. The gesture was small, but somehow momentous, as if she was setting aside more than just a piece of jewelry. "I was traveling to Cedar Falls to marry a man I've never met," she continued, "an arrangement made by family who found my blindness inconvenient. But sitting here, speaking with you, I'm wondering if perhaps this accident was meant to happen. Perhaps I was meant to meet the real Silas Cain instead of the legend." Outside, the wind had picked up again, whistling through the pines and rattling the windows of the cabin. But inside, in the warm glow of the firelight, something was shifting. Between two people who had both learned to expect nothing from the world but pain and solitude. For the first time in 15 years, Silas found himself hoping that the weather would keep the trails impassable for just a little while longer. 3 days passed, like a gentle dream neither wanted to wake from. Sarah's injuries were healing, well under Silas's careful attention, and she had insisted on helping with whatever tasks her condition would allow. It was during one of these domestic moments that she discovered the first artifact of his hidden nature, a small wooden toy. Horse tucked behind a stack of firewood. Her fingers found it while she was organizing kindling by size, something she could do by touch. The carving was exquisite, smooth and detailed, clearly made with love and infinite patience. When she brought it to Silas, sitting silently by the fire, she felt his entire body tense. "I found this," she said gently, holding the toy horse in her palm. "It's beautiful work." For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he told her, "I made it for my son, before he was born." The words hung in the air, like smoke from the fire, and Sarah felt the weight of his loss settle around them. She didn't ask what had happened. She didn't need to. The pain in his voice told her everything. Instead, she traced the smooth lines of the carving with careful fingers, feeling the love that had gone into every curve and detail. "He would have treasured it," she said simply, handing it back to him. That evening, as they shared a simple dinner of venison stew and cornbread, Sarah learned more about the man behind the legend. Silas was well educated, she discovered, with a knowledge of books and ideas that surprised her. He had built not just a cabin, but a life of careful routine and self-sufficiency. Every morning he rose before dawn to tend his small garden, check his snares, and maintain his property. He could track animals, predict weather, and had medical knowledge that served him well in his solitary existence. "How did you learn to do all this?" she asked, genuinely curious. "Necessity," he replied, but she sensed there was more to it. A man alone learns to do for himself, or he doesn't survive. "But before," she pressed gently, "you weren't always alone." He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then slowly he began to tell her about his life before the mountain. He had been a sheriff in Cedar Falls, respected and trusted by the community. He had married his childhood sweetheart Martha, and they had been expecting their first child when everything changed. "There was a fire," he said, his voice carefully controlled. Our house. Martha was trapped inside. I tried to get to her, but the roof collapsed before I could reach her. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes at the pain in his words. I'm so sorry. That's not the worst of it, he continued. Some people said I set the fire myself, said I wanted the insurance money, said a man my size could have saved her if he'd really wanted to. The cruelty of it took Sarah's breath away, but surely people who knew you didn't believe such lies. Some did, some didn't, but the doubt was enough. I couldn't stay where every day I had to see the question in people's eyes. Did he do it? Is he a killer? He stood abruptly and moved to the window, his massive frame silhouetted against the glass. So I came here, where no one would have to wonder. That night, Sarah lay in the bed he had given her while he slept on the floor by the fire, thinking about the man who had saved her life. The stories told in Cedar Falls painted him as a monster, but the reality was a man so wounded by loss and betrayal that he had chosen exile over the risk of facing more pain. She understood that choice. Hadn't she been running too from an arranged marriage that would have trapped her in a life without love or respect? The next morning brought a new understanding between them. Sarah woke to find Silas already up, preparing breakfast with quiet efficiency. When she insisted on helping, he didn't refuse her, as he had the first few days. Instead, he guided her hands to show her where things were, how his kitchen was organized, what tasks she could safely manage. I don't want to be a burden, she said, as she carefully measured coffee into the pot. You're not, he replied, and she could hear the honesty in his voice. It's been a long time since I had someone to cook for besides myself. As the morning progressed, they settled into an easy rhythm. Sarah couldn't see the beauty of the mountain landscape, but Silas described it for her, the way the morning mist clung to the peaks, how the aspens were just beginning to turn gold, the path that eagles took as they rode the thermals between the summits. His voice was different when he spoke of the mountains, gentler, almost poetic. You love it here, she observed. It's been my sanctuary, he admitted. My prison too, I suppose, but sanctuary first. It doesn't have to be a prison, she said carefully. Not if you don't want it to be. He was quiet at that, but she sensed her words had found their mark. Later that afternoon, when a cold rain began to fall, they sat by the fire while Sarah mended a tear in her dress and Silas carved something from a piece of pine. The silence between them was comfortable now, filled with the crackling of the fire and the gentle sound of rain on the roof. Sarah, he said suddenly, and something in his voice made her look up from her sewing. Yes, why aren't you afraid of me? The question was asked with such genuine puzzlement that it made her heart ache. She set down her mending and turned toward him, wishing she could see his face. Because fear is something you choose, she said. After I lost my sight, people treated me like I was broken, like I was less than I had been before. They spoke to me like I was a child or an invalid. But blindness doesn't change who you are inside. It just changes how you experience the world. She paused, searching for the right words. When I listen to you, when I feel how gentle your hands are when you tend my injuries, when I hear the love in your voice as you describe these mountains, that's who you really are. The rest is just stories people tell because they don't know any better. That evening, as Silas banked the fire for the night, he noticed that Sarah had left her, wedding ring on the table beside the bed. In the flickering firelight, the simple gold band seemed to represent more than just an abandoned engagement. It was a symbol of a life she was choosing not to live, of expectations she was finally ready to set aside. For the first time in 15 years, as he listened to her soft breathing from across the room, Silas Kane allowed himself to imagine a future that wasn't just about survival. It was a dangerous thought, one that opened doors he had welded shut long ago, but as sleep finally claimed him, he found he didn't want to close those doors again. A week into Sarah's stay, Silas found himself looking forward to each new day. in a way he hadn't experienced since before Martha's death. Sarah had insisted on taking over more of the household tasks, despite his protests that she was still recovering. She had a way of moving through his space that was both confident and careful, memorizing the location of every pot, every piece of furniture, every step between the stove and the table. It was while she was hanging laundry on the line behind the cabin that Silas discovered she had been quietly organizing his belongings. His shirts were now folded in neat stacks, his books arranged by size, his medical supplies sorted in a way that made perfect sense. But it was what she had done with her own possessions that caught his attention most. On the small table beside what had become her bed, she had arranged her few belongings with deliberate care. Her mother's Bible was there, along with the daguerreotype of her parents and her books, written in raised letters, but tucked carefully beneath the family photograph was the blue ribbon she had worn in her hair the day of the accident. Silas had found it later, torn and muddy, and had washed and pressed it without thinking to return it to her. Now, seeing it displayed among her treasures, he realized she had discovered his small kindness. The ribbon seemed so simple, just a piece of blue silk, but somehow it had become a symbol of the care they were beginning to show each other. "You kept my ribbon," she said that evening as they sat by the fire. Silas felt heat rise in his cheeks. "I thought you might want it back." "I did want it back," she said softly, "but I wanted it back because you cared enough to save it." Their days together had developed a rhythm that felt natural, despite its newness. Mornings were for chores, Sarah insisting on helping with cooking and cleaning, while Silas tended to the heavier work of maintaining their mountain home. Afternoons were often spent sitting together while she mended clothes or organized supplies, and he carved or repaired tools. Evenings belonged to conversation, long talks by the fire that revealed more about each other with every passing day. Sarah told him about her childhood in Ohio, where her father had been a teacher and her mother a seamstress. She spoke of her love for learning, her plans to become a teacher herself before illness took her sight. She described the books she had read, the places she had dreamed of visiting, the life she had imagined before fate redirected her path. "I used to think losing my sight was the worst thing that could happen to me," she said one evening, as rain drummed against the windows. "Now I wonder if it wasn't meant to teach me something important." "What's that?" Silas asked, genuinely curious. "That the most important things about a person can't be seen with your eyes anyway." In return, Silas found himself sharing memories he had locked away for years. He told her about his childhood as the largest boy in every room, how he had learned early that his size could frighten people if he wasn't careful with it. He spoke of his father, a blacksmith who had taught him that strength was a responsibility, not a weapon. He described Martha, how they had met, how she had been the first person to see past his imposing physical presence to the gentle soul beneath. "She sounds wonderful," Sarah said when he finished describing his late wife. "She was," he replied. "I never thought I'd find that kind of connection again." The words hung between them, heavy with implication, and Sarah felt her heart skip in a way that both thrilled and frightened her. It was the following day that their peaceful routine was shattered by danger from an unexpected source. Sarah was gathering herbs from the small garden behind the cabin when she heard it, a low growl that seemed to come from the very earth itself. She froze, every sense suddenly alert, trying to determine the direction of the sound. The mountain. Lion had been watching the cabin for days, drawn by the scent of humans and the promise of easy prey. It was an old female, past her prime and desperate for food as winter approached. Now, seeing the small human alone and vulnerable, she crept forward through the underbrush. Sarah heard the soft pad of paws on earth and felt the hair on the back of her neck stand up. She had no idea what kind of animal was approaching, but every instinct screamed danger. Slowly, carefully, she began to back toward the cabin, her hands extended to feel for obstacles. "Silas," she called, keeping her voice calm despite the terror. coursing through her veins. The mountain lion chose that moment to attack, launching herself from the brush with a scream that echoed off the canyon walls. Sarah heard the sound of death approaching and did the only thing she could. She stood her ground and screamed back, throwing her arms wide to make herself appear larger, just as her father had taught her when they encountered aggressive dogs. During her childhood, Silas burst from the cabin at the sound of Sarah's scream, taking in the scene in an instant. The mountain lion was in mid-leap, claws extended, aimed directly at the woman who had become more precious to him than his own life. Without thinking, he threw himself between them, his massive frame absorbing the impact of the big cat's attack. The fight was brief but violent. The mountain lion, surprised by this new and much larger opponent, tried to flee, but Silas couldn't let it escape to threaten Sarah again. Using strength born of desperation and protective fury, he wrestled the animal to the ground, his hands finding its throat. When it was over, both he and the mountain lion lay still. "Silas!" Sarah's voice was frantic as she felt her way toward where she had heard the struggle. "Silas, are you hurt?" She found him sitting against a tree, breathing hard, his shirt torn and bloody from the cat's claws. But he was alive, and when her hands found his face, he caught them in his own. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "You saved my life," she whispered. And then, without thinking, she leaned forward and kissed him. The kiss was gentle, tentative, but it carried the weight of all the feelings that had been building between them over the past week. When they broke apart, both were trembling, not from fear or cold, but from the realization that what had begun as shelter from a storm had become something neither had expected to find again. "Sarah," he began, but she placed her fingers against his lips. "Don't say it can't happen," she said. "Don't tell me all the reasons why this is impossible. I've spent too many years listening to other people tell me what I can and can't do." That night, as Silas cleaned and bandaged his wounds, Sarah sat beside him in a silence that thrummed with new understanding. They had crossed a line from which there could be no retreat, had acknowledged feelings that changed everything about their situation. Outside, the mountain lion would feed the scavengers, but inside the cabin, two wounded souls had found something worth risking their careful solitude to protect. When Sarah finally spoke, her words were barely above a whisper. "I know you're afraid of losing someone again, but Silas, sometimes the thing we're most afraid of is the only thing that can save us." As the fire burned low and shadows danced across the walls, Silas realized that for the first time in 15 years, he was more afraid of letting go than he was of holding on. The morning after the mountain lion attack brought with it an intimacy that both surprised and comforted them. Sarah tended Silas's wounds with the same gentle care he had shown her, her fingers tracing the claw marks across his chest and shoulders with a touch that was both medical and tender. They didn't speak of the kiss, but it hung between them like a promise neither was quite ready to voice. It was while cleaning out his medicine chest that Sarah discovered the letter, yellowed with age and worn soft from handling. It had fallen from behind a jar of salve, and when she asked him about it, Silas went very still. "It's nothing important," he said, but his voice carried the weight of old pain. Sarah held the letter carefully, feeling the delicate paper between her fingers. "It feels important. The paper is so soft, like it's been read many times." For a long moment, Silas said nothing. Then, with the careful movements of a man handling something precious and fragile, he took the letter from her hands. "I wrote it. To Martha," he said quietly. "After the fire, after the accusations, I never sent it." "What does it say?" He was quiet for so long that Sarah thought he wouldn't answer. Then in a voice barely above a whisper, he began to read. "My dearest Martha, I know you can't hear me now, but I need to tell you how sorry I am. Sorry I couldn't save you. Sorry I couldn't save our son. Sorry that the last thing you heard before the fire took you was me breaking down the door too late to matter. The people in town think I killed you for the insurance money. Maybe it would be easier if I had. Then at least I deserve this pain. But the truth is worse, isn't it? The truth is that I failed you when you needed me most. I loved you with everything I had, and it wasn't enough. I don't know how to live with that, Martha. I don't know how to live at all." When he finished reading, tears were streaming down Sarah's face. She reached for him, her hands finding his face, wiping away tears he didn't realize he was shedding. "You didn't fail her," she said firmly. "You loved her. Sometimes love isn't enough to stop terrible things from happening, but that doesn't make the love any less real or important." "How can you be so sure?" "Because I can hear it in your voice when you speak her name. Because I've felt how gentle your hands are, how carefully you tend wounds, how you risk your own life to protect others. A man who could murder his wife for money couldn't do those things." That afternoon, as storm clouds gathered over the peaks, they sat together on the small porch of the cabin. Sarah had insisted they take advantage of the last warm weather before winter set in, and Silas had reluctantly agreed. He was learning that saying no to Sarah was nearly impossible when she set her mind to something. "Tell me about the search." "Parties," she said suddenly. Silas looked at her in surprise. "How did you know?" "I can hear them sometimes when the wind is right. Voices calling, horses moving through the trees. They're looking for me, aren't they?" He nodded, though she couldn't see the gesture. "Harold Whitmore has been leading them, your intended husband. He's posted a reward for information about your whereabouts." Sarah was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice was thoughtful. "He doesn't know me at all, does he? If he did, he'd know I wouldn't want to be found by force." "What do you want?" Silas asked, though he was afraid of the answer. She turned toward him, her unseeing eyes somehow finding his. "I want to stay here with you. I want to wake up every morning knowing I'm exactly where I'm meant to be. I want to learn every inch of this mountain, every story you have to tell, every scar on your heart that needs healing." "Sarah, I know what you're going to say, that I'm running away from my responsibilities, that I barely know you, that this is all too fast and too uncertain. But Silas, I've been making safe choices my whole life, and where did it get me? Blind and shipped off to marry a stranger because I was too much trouble for my family to handle." She stood and moved to the porch railing, her hands gripping the rough wood. "When I lost my sight, I thought my life was over. I thought I'd never be independent again, never be truly wanted by anyone. But here, with you, I feel more alive than I have since before the fever. I feel like myself again." That evening, their conversation turned to more practical matters. Winter was coming, and if Sarah was going to stay, if they were going to make a life together, there were preparations to be made. Silas's cabin was built for one person. It would need modifications to comfortably house two. More firewood would need to be cut, more food preserved, winter clothes mended and prepared. "I can help with all of that," Sarah insisted. "I'm not helpless." "I know you're not," Silas replied, "but Sarah, you need to understand what you'd be choosing. Winters up here are harsh. We could be snowed in for months. And if people in town discover you're here willingly, they'll say you kidnapped me anyway," she finished. "They'll say you forced me to stay, that I'm not capable of making my own decisions because I'm blind. I know how people think, Silas. I've been dealing with their assumptions about my limitations for months." As they prepared for bed that night, the weight of the decisions facing them settled over the cabin, like the gathering clouds outside. Sarah had made her choice, but Silas was still wrestling with his. To accept her offer to stay meant risking not just his own heart, but her safety and reputation. It meant believing that he was worthy of love again, that he could protect someone he cared about without failing, as he had with Martha. But as he listened to Sarah's quiet breathing from across the room, he realized that the greater risk might be in letting her go. She had brought light into his self-imposed darkness, had seen past the monster the world believed him to be, to the man he had once been. For the first time in 15 years, he was remembering who Silas Kane had been before. Grief and guilt had twisted him into a hermit, Outside, the wind picked up, whistling through the pines with the promise of an early winter storm. But inside the cabin, two hearts were slowly learning to trust again, to hope again, to believe that even the most broken people could find their way back to wholeness if they had someone to share the journey. The letter to Martha still lay on the table where Silas had left it after reading it aloud. In the morning, he would take it outside and burn it, letting the words of guilt and self-blame turn to ash and blow away on the mountain wind. It was time to write a different kind of letter, one to the future instead of the past, one filled with hope instead of regret. As sleep finally claimed them both, neither heard the sound of horses moving carefully through the trees below or saw the flicker of torches as the search party made camp for the night. Harold Whitmore was getting closer, and with him came the reckoning that would test whether their newfound love was strong enough to survive the judgment of the outside world. The photograph was hidden in the bottom of an old ammunition box, wrapped in oiled cloth like a sacred relic. Sarah discovered it while helping Silas organize his few possessions, her fingers recognizing the shape and texture of a daguerreotype through the protective wrapping. When she asked about it, he hesitated for so long that she almost withdrew the question. "It's the only picture I have of them," he said finally. "Martha and our son." Sarah's hands stilled on the wrapped photograph. "Your son?" Martha was 8 months along when the fire started. The doctor said he might have lived if... His voice broke and he couldn't finish the sentence. With infinite care, Sarah unwrapped the photograph and placed it in Silas's hands. Though she couldn't see the image, she could feel the tremor in his fingers as he held it, could hear the sharp intake of breath that spoke of pain, still fresh after 15 years. "Tell me about them," she said softly. Silas looked down at the faded image, Martha with her hand resting on her swollen belly, her face radiant with the joy of impending motherhood. They had planned to name the baby Thomas, after Martha's father. They had prepared a cradle, chosen a name, dreamed of the future they would build together. Martha was the baker's daughter, he began, his voice steadying as he spoke. She had flour under her fingernails more often than not, and she always smelled like cinnamon and fresh bread. She was half my size, but she never let my height intimidate her. From the first day we met, she treated me like I was just a man, not a giant. Sarah listened as he described their courtship, their wedding, the joy they had felt when they learned about the baby. She heard the love in his voice, but also the guilt that had poisoned his memories for so long. "She would have loved you," he said suddenly. "Martha always said the best way to judge a person's character was to watch how they treated those who couldn't do anything for them in return. You've shown me more kindness in 2 weeks than I've received in 15 years. Outside, the autumn wind carried the sound of voices, closer now than they had been before. The search for Sarah was intensifying, and Harold Whitmore was bringing more men into the mountains with each passing day. Silas had spotted their campfires from his high vantage points, had counted the horses and guns. They were no longer just searching, they were preparing for a confrontation. "We need to talk about what's coming," Silas said that evening as they sat by the fire. "Whitmore isn't going to give up, and winter won't stop him. He's convinced himself that I've taken you against your will." Sarah set down her mending and turned toward him. "What do you think he'll do when he finds us?" "Nothing good. He's brought armed men with him, Sarah, men who've heard the stories about me, who believe I'm capable of terrible things. They won't listen to reason, and they won't care what you say." The weight of their situation settled over them like a heavy blanket. For 2 weeks, they had existed in a bubble of growing intimacy and tentative hope. But the outside world was closing in, bringing with it all the fears and prejudices that had driven Silas into exile in the first place. "There's something else," Silas said, his voice careful. "Something you need to know about Harold Whitmore." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "What about him?" "I've been asking around, carefully, through some contacts I still have in the territory. Whitmore isn't just any businessman. He's connected to some of the most corrupt land deals in the territory. There are rumors about the previous women he married. Both died under suspicious circumstances, and both left him considerably wealthier. Sarah's blood ran cold. You think he's dangerous? I think you were never meant to be a wife to him, Silas said grimly. I think you were meant to be another victim. That night, they made plans with the urgency of people who understood their time was running out. If they were going to build a life together, they needed to do more than simply hide in the mountains. They needed to reclaim Silas's name, expose the truth about his past, and find a way to protect Sarah from a man who saw her as nothing more than property. Tell me about the fire again, Sarah said as they sat planning by lamplight. Everything you remember, every detail that seemed strange or out of place. Silas closed his eyes, forcing himself to relive the worst night of his life. It started in the kitchen, he said slowly, but Martha was already in bed. She never left lamps burning, never left anything that could cause a fire. And the front door was barred from the outside when I got home. Someone set the fire, Sarah said with certainty. Someone wanted Martha and your baby dead, and they wanted you to be blamed for it. But who and why? Sarah was quiet. For a long moment, her mind working through the possibilities. Who benefited from your downfall? Who gained power or position when you lost yours? The answer, when it came to Silas, hit him like a physical blow. Benjamin Croft, he whispered. He was the deputy who testified against me. Said he'd seen me acting suspicious around the house that day. After I left town, he was elected sheriff. Where? Is Croft now? Still sheriff, as far as I know. Still telling people about the night he tried to arrest the murderous giant who killed his own family. As the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, they realized they were facing more than just a search party led by a dangerous suitor. They were confronting a conspiracy that had destroyed Silas's life and was now threatening to destroy Sarah's as well. We have to go back, Sarah said suddenly. We have to go to Cedar Falls and expose the truth. Sarah, that's madness. If I show my face in that town, if you don't, we'll spend our whole lives running. Is that what you want? To live in fear? To let lies define who you are? Silas looked at the photograph of Martha and their unborn son, then at the woman who had brought hope back into his life. Sarah was right. They couldn't build a future on a foundation of lies and fear, but going back to Cedar Falls would mean risking everything, including their lives. All right, he said finally, but we do this my way. Carefully, with planning, and with backup. What kind of backup? There are a few people in the territory who knew the truth about me, who never believed the lies. It's time to call in some old debts. As they finalized their plans, the wind outside grew stronger, carrying with it the scent of snow. Winter was coming early to the high country, but it would not find them hiding in the mountains. Instead, it would find two people who had chosen to fight for their love and their future, no matter the cost. The photograph of Martha and baby Thomas sat on the table between them, no longer a symbol of guilt and loss, but a reminder of why truth mattered, why justice was worth fighting for. Silas had failed to protect his first family, but he would not fail Sarah. This time, he would face his accusers with proof, with allies, and with a woman beside him who saw him not as a monster, but as a man worth loving. Outside, snow began to fall in earnest, covering the mountain in a blanket of white that would make tracking difficult but not impossible. Harold Whitmore and his men would have to retreat for the winter, but they would be back with the spring thaw. By then, Silas and Sarah intended to be ready for them, not as fugitives hiding in the mountains, but as a couple fighting for their right to love and be loved, armed with the truth that had been buried for 15 years. The old sheriff's badge was buried beneath the floorboards in the corner of the cabin, wrapped in the same oiled cloth that had protected Martha's photograph. Silas had hidden it there. The night he fled Cedar Falls, unable to destroy the symbol of everything he had once stood for, but unable to bear looking at it either. Now, 15 years later, as he dug it from its hiding place, the weight of the star-shaped piece of tin felt heavier than all the years that had passed. Sarah heard the scrape of metal against wood as he pried up the floorboard, heard his sharp intake of breath as he unwrapped his past. "Sheriff Silas Kane," she said softly, reading the engraved words with her fingertips when he placed the badge in her hands. "You never told me you were the law." "I wasn't just the law," Silas said, his voice heavy with memory. "It was supposed to be the solution to Cedar Falls' problems. The town had been plagued by claim jumpers, cattle rustlers, and worse. They needed someone who could stand up to the hard men who came through looking for easy money. Someone who couldn't be intimidated or bought. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. The very qualities that had made Silas an effective sheriff, his size, his strength, his reputation for uncompromising justice, had made it easy for people to believe he was capable of murder when his world fell apart. "Tell me about Benjamin." "Croft," Sarah said, settling beside him on the floor of the cabin. Silas stared at the badge in his hands, remembering the young deputy who had seemed so eager to learn, so committed to justice. "I thought he was a good man. Honest, hard-working, dedicated to protecting the innocent. I was grooming him to take over for me someday, when Martha and I had our family, and I wanted to step back from the more dangerous aspects of the job." "What changed?" "Nothing changed. That was the problem. I was blind to what he really was." Silas's voice grew bitter with self-recrimination. "Croft wasn't interested in justice. He was interested in power, and I was standing in his way. He'd been taking bribes from claim jumpers, looking the other way when cattle went missing, protecting the very criminals I'd been hired to stop." Sarah felt the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with horrifying clarity. "And when you got close to discovering his corruption, he needed me gone. But simply killing me would have raised too many questions. Better to destroy my reputation first, make people believe I was capable of murdering my own family. Then, when he reluctantly testified against me, he'd look like a hero for standing up to a corrupt sheriff." The full scope of the conspiracy was beginning to reveal itself, but Sarah sensed there was more. "Harold Whitmore," she said. "He's connected to this somehow, isn't he?" Silas nodded grimly. Whitmore was one of the businessmen Croft was protecting. He'd been buying up land around Cedar Falls, using false claims and intimidation. When rightful owners protested, they had a way of disappearing or dying in accidents. I was getting close to proving the connection when the fire happened. And now he wants to marry me. Not marry you, own you, control you, use your inheritance from your parents to expand his operations. Silas looked at her with eyes full of anguish. "Sarah, I think your uncle was paid to arrange this marriage. I think your blindness made you seem like the perfect victim, someone who couldn't see what was really happening, someone others would think incapable of making informed decisions." The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. Everything. Her uncle's sudden insistence on the marriage, Harold Whitmore's interest in a blind bride he'd never met, even the specific route the stagecoach had taken through the mountains, had been orchestrated. She hadn't stumbled into Silas's world by accident. She'd been driven there by men who wanted to use her and then dispose of her. "We have to expose them," she said, her voice steady, despite the rage building inside her. "We have to make sure they can't hurt anyone else. It won't be easy. Croft has had 15 years to solidify his position, to place his own people in positions of power, and Whitmore has money, influence, the ability to make people disappear if they threaten him. But we have something they don't," Sarah said, placing her hand over the sheriff's badge. "We have the truth, and we have each other." That night, they planned with the precision of military strategists. Silas still had allies in the territory, men who had never believed the lies about him, lawmen in other towns who had known him before his fall from grace, even a few people in Cedar Falls who had always harbored doubts about the official story of Martha's death. "There's a federal marshal named Tom Harrison," Silas said as they worked by lamplight. He was my friend before everything happened. If anyone would listen to our story, it would be Tom. Where is he now? Last I heard, he was stationed in Denver. It would take time to get word to him, but if we could convince him to investigate, then we'd have federal law on our side instead of local corruption, Sarah finished. They wrote carefully, laying out their evidence in a letter that would either save them or destroy them completely. The conspiracy they were alleging involved murder, fraud, corruption of public officials, and a pattern of violence that had lasted for years. If they were wrong, or if their letter fell into the wrong hands, they would both be dead before spring. But as Sarah listened to Silas describe the details of his case, the evidence that had been ignored, the witnesses who had been intimidated, into silence, the convenient way certain documents had disappeared, she knew they were right. The truth had a weight to it, a consistency that lies could never match. "There's one more thing," Silas said as he sealed the letter. "If we're going to do this, we need to make sure Whitmore doesn't simply kill us and claim we died in an accident. We need witnesses, people who know what we're doing and why. What do you suggest? We make ourselves visible. We go back to Cedar Falls openly, publicly. We force them to act in daylight instead of shadows." Sarah felt a thrill of fear mixed with excitement. After months of being treated like a helpless victim, she was finally going to take control of her own fate. "When do we leave?" "Spring," Silas said. "We use the winter to prepare, to contact our allies, to gather more evidence, and when the snow melts and the trails are clear again, we go home." Outside, the wind howled through the peaks with the voice of winter itself. But inside the cabin, two people who had found love in the most unlikely circumstances were planning to fight for their future. The badge of Sheriff Silas Kane lay on the table between them, no longer a symbol of loss and failure, but a reminder of the man he had been and could be again. For 15 years, Silas Kane had been dead to the world, existing only as a legend, whispered in fear around campfires. But legends, Sarah was learning, had a way of coming back to life when the truth demanded it. And when spring came to the Colorado Territory, the legend of the giant mountain man would become something far more dangerous to his enemies. The reality of a lawman with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. Spring came to the mountains, with a violence that matched the storm brewing in the valley below. The snow melted in rushing torrents that swelled the creeks and turned the trails into rivers of mud. But by May, the passes were clear enough for travel. Silas stood at the edge of his property, strapping on his old gun belt for the first time. In 15 years, the weight of it both familiar and strange, the leather holster had been carefully oiled and maintained during his years of exile. The revolver inside cleaned and ready, despite never being used. These weren't the tools of a hermit or a monster. They were the weapons of a lawman, and wearing them again felt like putting on a second skin he had almost forgotten he possessed. "Are you ready for this?" Sarah asked, her hand resting on his arm as they stood looking down toward the valley. "No," he said honestly, "but I'm ready to stop running." Their winter of preparation had borne fruit in ways neither had expected. The letter to Marshal Tom Harrison had not only reached its intended recipient, but had sparked a federal investigation that was already underway. Harrison, now a senior marshal with the authority to pursue cases across territorial boundaries, had been quietly gathering evidence about corruption in Cedar Falls for months. Silas's testimony had provided the missing pieces he needed to build a case. More importantly, they weren't going into Cedar Falls alone. 3 of Harrison's deputies were already in town, posing as traveling businessmen while they documented the connections between Benjamin Croft, Harold Whitmore, and a network of corruption that reached far beyond a single mountain community. The evidence they had gathered was damning. Forged documents, intimidated witnesses, a pattern of convenient deaths that could no longer be explained away as coincidence. "Remember," Silas said as they loaded their few possessions onto his horse, "once we ride down that mountain, there's no going back. Whitmore and Croft will know we're coming, and they'll do whatever it takes to stop us." Sarah adjusted the simple dress she had chosen for their return, not the torn and muddy garment she had worn when she first stumbled into his world, but a clean, respectable outfit that spoke of dignity and determination. She had pinned her hair back with the blue ribbon Silas had saved, a small symbol of the journey that had brought them together. "I'm not afraid," she said, and meant it. "For the first time in my life, I know exactly who I am and what I'm fighting for." The ride down the mountain took most of the morning, the familiar trails passing beneath their horses' hooves like chapters in a story Silas had been trying to forget. Every turn brought back memories. The place where he had first learned to track as a boy, the creek where he had proposed to Martha, the overlook where he had stood on his wedding day, feeling like the luckiest man in the territory. But as they descended towards Cedar Falls, those bittersweet memories were joined by harder ones. The last time he had ridden this trail, he had been fleeing for his life, accused of murdering the woman he loved more than breath itself. Now he was returning as an accused killer's last hope for justice, accompanied by a woman who had helped him remember that he was more than the sum of his worst moments. The town spread out below them as they crested the final ridge, unchanged in the essentials, despite 15 years of growth. Main Street still ran straight as an arrow from the church at one end to the saloon at the other, with the sheriff's office, his old office, sitting squarely in the middle like the heart of the community. Smoke rose from chimneys, people moved along the boardwalks, and life continued much as it always had in Cedar Falls. But Silas could see the changes that spoke of Croft's corruption. New businesses lined the street, many bearing signs that read Whitmore Enterprises. The mine at the edge of town had expanded considerably, its operations now sprawling across land that had once belonged to independent prospectors. The wealth was visible, but so was the fear. People walked with their heads down, avoided eye contact, moved with the careful steps of those who knew they were being watched. "It's different than I expected," Sarah said, reading the town through the sounds that carried up to them on the morning breeze. "How so?" "It's too quiet. A town this size should have more noise, children playing, people calling to each other, the general bustle of daily life. This feels like a place where people are afraid to draw attention to themselves." Silas nodded grimly. Fear was a tool that corrupt men used as effectively as guns or money, and Benjamin Croft had clearly learned to wield it well. But fear was also fragile. It only worked as long as people believed they had no choice but to submit to it. As they rode down Main Street, heads turned and conversations stopped. The legend of the giant mountain man was well known in Cedar Falls, but seeing the reality of Silas Kane, clean, well-dressed, clearly in control of himself and his circumstances, challenged 15 years of carefully maintained mythology. Whispers followed in their wake, but so did something else, curiosity, and perhaps the first stirrings of doubt about the stories people had been told. The sheriff's office sat exactly where Silas remembered it, but the man wearing his old badge was a stranger grown familiar. Benjamin Croft had aged into the role of authority, his hair now silver, his face lined with the careful expressions of a man who had spent years maintaining a lie. When he saw Silas approaching, his hand moved instinctively toward his gun. Well, Croft said, stepping out onto the boardwalk with the exaggerated casualness of a man trying to project confidence he didn't feel. "If it isn't the famous giant of the mountain. And who might this young lady be?" "My name is Sarah Morrison," she said clearly, her voice carrying easily to the growing crowd of onlookers. "And I believe you gentlemen have been looking for me." The reaction was immediate and electric. Harold Whitmore emerged from the bank across the street, his face flushed with anger and something that might have been panic. "Sarah, thank God you're safe. We've been searching for weeks. What did this monster do to you?" Sarah stepped closer to Silas, her hand resting on his arm in a gesture that spoke louder than words. "Mr. Kane saved my life," she said, "and in the process he helped me discover some very interesting things about the men who arranged my marriage." "Whitmore's," Face went pale, but Croft stepped forward, his hand now openly resting on his gun. "Now see here," he said. "This woman is clearly not thinking straight. She's been held captive by a murderer for months. She needs medical attention, not what she needs," said a new voice from the crowd, "is to tell her story to someone who will listen without prejudice." Marshal Tom Harrison stepped into view, his federal badge glinting in the morning sun. Behind him came his 3 deputies, no longer pretending to be traveling businessmen. The careful neutrality of their expressions sent a chill through the watching crowd. These were lawmen who had seen corruption before and knew how to root it out. "Marshal Harrison," Croft said, his voice carefully controlled, "what brings federal law to our humble community?" "Unfinished business," Harrison replied. 15 years' worth of unfinished business. He looked at Silas with eyes that held both regret and respect. "Hello, old friend. It's time we had that conversation we should have had a long time ago." As the two groups faced each other in the dusty street, the entire town seemed to hold its breath. This was the moment, 15 years, in the making, the confrontation that would either vindicate Silas Kane or destroy him completely. But as Sarah squeezed his arm and he felt the weight of his badge in his pocket, Silas realized he was no longer afraid of the outcome. The truth had a power of its own, and after years of hiding in shadows, it was finally ready to step into the light. The documents that Marshal Harrison spread across the table in the sheriff's office painted a picture of corruption so vast and systematic that even Silas was shocked by its scope. 15 years of evidence had been meticulously gathered: forged land deeds, falsified death certificates, testimony from witnesses who had been too frightened to speak before, but now found courage in federal protection. "This is what we've been able to verify," Harrison said, his voice cutting through the tense silence that filled the room. "Harold Whitmore has fraudulently acquired over 30,000 acres of land in the past decade, using a combination of forged documents, intimidation, and murder to remove rightful owners. Benjamin Croft has been his enforcer, using his position as sheriff to make these crimes appear legal." Croft stood behind his desk, his face a mask of controlled fury, while Whitmore paced by the window like a caged animal. The crowd that had gathered outside was growing larger, drawn by the unprecedented sight of federal marshals arresting local officials. "These are serious accusations," Croft said carefully, "but accusations aren't proof. You'll need more than the word of a known murderer, and a woman who's clearly been traumatized by her captivity." Sarah stepped forward, her spine straight and her voice clear. "I wasn't traumatized by my time with Mr. Kane. I was educated by it. Educated about the kind of men who would arrange a marriage between a blind woman and a killer, then profit from her inheritance when she conveniently died in an accident." She pulled a folded paper from her reticule, the marriage contract her uncle had signed on her behalf. "This document grants Harold Whitmore control of my parents' estate upon our marriage. It also contains a clause that transfers ownership to him permanently if I should die within the first year of marriage, a clause I was never told about." Whitmore's face went white. "That's a standard provision. In a murder contract, perhaps," Sarah interrupted. "But not in a marriage agreement, unless, of course, murder was always part of the plan." Harrison examined the document, his expression growing darker with each line he read. "This is the same language we found in the marriage contracts of Whitmore's previous wives, both of whom died within 8 months of their weddings." "Accidents happen," Whitmore said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Yes, they do," Silas said, speaking for the first time since they had entered the office. "Just like the accident that killed my wife and unborn son, just like the convenient accident that would have befallen Sarah if she had married you as planned." He pulled the sheriff's badge from his pocket and set it on the desk, with a metallic clink that seemed to echo through the room. "I've been thinking about accidents for 15 years, Benjamin. Thinking about how my house caught fire when Martha was alone and vulnerable. thinking about how the front door was barred from the outside, thinking about how you happened to be nearby to witness my suspicious behavior. Croft's hand moved toward his gun, but Harrison's deputies were already in position. "I wouldn't," one of them said quietly. "The fire wasn't an accident," Silas continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "It was murder. You killed my family because I was getting too close to your operation with Whitmore. You killed them and then blamed me for it, knowing that my size and reputation would make people willing to believe I was capable of such brutality." "Prove it," Croft snarled. "You can't prove any of this." "Actually," Harrison said, opening another folder, "we can." He pulled out a stack of photographs and documents. "We found the man you hired to set the fire. Jake Morrison. He spent the last 15 years in a prison in Kansas, and he was very interested in talking when we offered him a deal in exchange for testimony." The name hit Silas like a physical blow. Jake Morrison, Sarah's maiden name, was Morrison. The coincidence was too specific to be accidental. "Sarah," he said, turning to her with growing horror, "what was your father's name?" "James Morrison," she replied, confusion evident in her voice. "Why?" "Jake Morrison is James Morrison's brother," Harrison said grimly. "Sarah's uncle, the man who arranged her marriage to Whitmore." He looked at Sarah with something approaching pity. "I'm sorry, Miss Morrison, but your uncle was paid to deliver you to Whitmore. He's been part of this conspiracy from the beginning." The revelation staggered Sarah, but she didn't break. Instead, she seemed to grow taller, her resolve hardening into something unbreakable. "My own family," she whispered. "They sold me to a murderer." "Family that would do such a thing isn't family at all," Silas said, moving to stand beside her. "But you're not alone anymore. You'll never be alone again." Whitmore chose that moment to make his move, lunging for the gun on Croft's desk, while the room's attention was focused on Sarah's revelation. But he had underestimated both Silas's reflexes and Sarah's awareness. She heard the scrape of his boots on the floor, the rustle of his clothing as he moved, and called out a warning that sent Silas into motion. The confrontation was brief but violent. Whitmore managed to grab Croft's revolver, but before he could bring it to bear, Silas's massive hand closed around his wrist with crushing force. The gun discharged harmlessly into the ceiling, and Whitmore found himself lifted off his feet by a man whose strength was legendary, even among those who feared him. 15 years, Silas said, his voice deadly quiet as he held Whitmore suspended in the air. 15 years I've lived with the guilt of failing to save my family. 15 years of believing I was a monster because I wasn't strong enough to break down a door in time. But the real monster was standing right here in this room, wasn't it? Whitmore struggled helplessly in Silas's grip, his feet kicking uselessly several inches off the ground. "You can't kill me," he gasped. "Not in front of federal marshals, not in front of all these witnesses." Silas looked into the eyes of the man who had destroyed his life, who had murdered his wife and child, who had planned to do the same to Sarah. For a moment, the temptation to squeeze just a little harder, to end 15 years of pain with a simple flex of his fingers, was almost overwhelming. But then he felt Sarah's hand on his arm, heard her voice speaking his name with love and trust, and remembered who he really was. He was not a monster. He had never been a monster. He was a lawman, a protector, a man who used his strength to defend the innocent rather than destroy them. With deliberate care, he set Whitmore back on his feet and stepped away. "You're right," he said. "I can't kill you, but I don't need to. The law will take care of you now." As Harrison's deputies moved in to make the arrests, the crowd outside erupted in a mixture of cheers and shocked murmurs. The truth was finally coming to light. 15 years of lies and corruption finally exposed to the harsh glare of justice. But for Silas and Sarah, standing together in the ruins of the conspiracy that had tried to destroy them both, the real victory was simpler and more profound. They had found each other, had chosen love over fear, truth over lies, and in doing so they had proven that even the deepest wounds could heal when tended by the right hands. The legend of the giant mountain man was finally dead, replaced by the reality of Sheriff Silas Kane and his wife Sarah. Two people who had proven that even the most broken hearts could learn to beat as one. As they turned to go inside, preparing for their first night as the legally recognized protectors of the community that had once cast them out, both Silas and Sarah understood that their story was far from over. It was, in many ways, just beginning. But they faced that future with the confidence of people who had already overcome the worst that life could offer, and had discovered that love, real love, was stronger than fear, stronger than lies, and stronger than the weight of the past. The town of Cedar Falls settled into sleep around them, but the echo of justice served and love vindicated would ring through the valley for generations to come. And high in the mountains, the cabin where two wounded souls had learned to heal each other stood empty but not abandoned. A reminder that sometimes the most unlikely places can become home when shared with the right person. Together, Silas echoed, and in that simple word was the promise of a future neither had dared to imagine when a blind bride first stumbled into a giant's mountain sanctuary. "Tomorrow we start over," Sarah said. Together, the wedding ring of carved stone caught the lamplight as Sarah raised their joined hands, studying the symbols Silas had etched into the granite. There were mountains representing their meeting place. There were intertwined vines symbolizing how their lives had grown together, and there, barely visible unless you knew where to look, were two small stars, one for Martha and her unborn son, whose memory would always be part of who Silas was, but who no longer cast shadows over his capacity to love again. "No more hiding," Silas agreed. "No more letting other people's fears define who we are." "No more running," Sarah said, her fingers intertwined with his as they watched the last light fade from the peaks. That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains that had sheltered their love, they stood together on the steps of the sheriff's office, their office now, since Sarah had accepted the town's offer to serve as the new schoolteacher. As the day wore on and the celebrations continued, Silas and Sarah found themselves surrounded by people who wanted to apologize, to explain, to somehow make amends for 15 years of believing lies. They accepted these gestures with grace, but both knew that the real work of rebuilding trust would take time. The child smiled and, without warning, threw her small arms around his neck in an embrace that brought tears to the eyes of everyone. Watching, it was a moment of pure innocence and acceptance, a symbol of the healing that was finally possible in Cedar Falls. "Sometimes people are afraid of things they don't understand," Silas replied. "But fear doesn't have to last forever. When we take time to really see each other, to listen to each other's stories, fear can turn into friendship." "My mama says you were scary," the child continued. "But you don't look scary to me." Silas knelt down so that he was closer to her eye, level, his massive frame folding with careful grace. "I'm just a man," he said gently, "a man who learned that being big on the outside doesn't matter as much as being good on the inside." One little girl, perhaps 7 years old, approached him with the fearless curiosity of childhood. "Are you really a giant?" she asked, craning her neck to look up at his towering frame. But the moment that would be remembered longest came when Silas stepped outside the courthouse and was confronted by a small group of children who had been too young to remember him. A sheriff, but old enough to have heard the stories about the giant of the mountain. The crowd's reaction to the verdicts was explosive. 15 years of suppressed justice erupted in cheers and applause that could be heard for blocks. People poured out of the courthouse and into the streets, celebrating not just the conviction of criminals, but the restoration of a man they had wronged and the return of real law to their community. Now, as the judge read the verdicts that would send Harold Whitmore and Benjamin Croft to federal prison for the rest of their lives, Sarah felt the weight of that promise settling around her like a warm cloak. They had faced the worst that fear and corruption could throw at them, and there, Love had not only survived, but grown stronger. "It's perfect," she had whispered, tracing the carved symbols with her fingertips, "because it was made by the hands that saved me, by the heart that chose to love me, despite every reason to stay afraid. It's not much to look at," he had said, when he placed it on her finger in the pre-dawn darkness of their hotel room. "But it's made from the same stone that built our cabin, the same mountain that brought us together. It's a promise that our love is as solid and enduring as the peaks themselves." Through it all, Sarah sat in the front row of the courtroom, her hand resting on a simple band of carved stone that Silas had given her that morning. It wasn't traditional gold or silver, but mountain granite polished smooth by his own hands, and carved with symbols of love and commitment that could be read by touch as well as sight. Her words opened the floodgates. One by one, people began to speak, witnesses who had been intimidated into silence, victims of Whitmore's land grabs, who had been too frightened to come forward, citizens who had harbored doubts about the official story but lacked the courage to voice them. The testimony painted a picture of a community held hostage by fear and corruption, but also of a community ready to reclaim its integrity. "I knew Martha Kane," she said, her voice shaking but determined. "I knew her heart, her kindness, her love for that man. And I knew, we all knew if we were honest, that Silas Kane would have died before harming a hair on her head. But we were afraid of admitting we'd been wrong, afraid of standing up to those who had power over us. The reaction was immediate and profound. Some people cheered, others wept openly, and more than a few hung their heads in shame for the years they had spent believing lies about a man who had only ever tried to protect them. But it was the moment when Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman who had survived the stagecoach accident, stood up and spoke, that truly broke the dam of fear that had held the town captive. "Citizens of Cedar Falls," Harrison announced to the packed courtroom, "I present to you your rightful sheriff, a man who has spent 15 years paying for crimes he never committed, whose reputation has been restored by evidence that proves his innocence beyond any shadow of doubt." But it was the moment when Silas Kane walked back into the courthouse wearing his sheriff's badge that truly marked the turning of the tide. Marshal Harrison had restored his commission that morning, declaring that Silas Kane had never legally ceased to be the sheriff of Cedar Falls. His resignation had been coerced under false accusations, making Benjamin Croft's tenure illegitimate from the start. The trial that followed was swift but thorough, conducted under the watchful eye of federal authority that brooked no corruption or intimidation. Cedar Falls had never seen such a concentration of outside law enforcement, and the atmosphere in town was electric with the possibility of real justice for the first time in years. 6 months later, the sound of children's laughter echoed through the Cedar Falls schoolhouse as Sarah Kane taught her afternoon lessons. The room was filled with young voices reciting their letters, but the lessons Sarah was most proud of had nothing to do with reading or arithmetic. "Can anyone tell me what we learned about making judgments based on appearances?" she asked, her fingers moving across the raised letters of a book as she spoke. A small hand shot up. "My papa says we should get to know people before we decide if they're good or bad." "That's right, Tommy. And why is that important?" "Because sometimes the biggest people have the biggest hearts," piped up another child, the same little girl who had hugged Silas outside the courthouse months ago. Sarah smiled, remembering how the children had initially been nervous around their blind teacher, just as the town had once been afraid of her giant husband. But time and patience had worked their magic, and now these same children looked forward to school each day, eager to learn not just their lessons, but the deeper truths about seeing past surface differences to the person within. Through the window, she could hear the steady rhythm of hammering from the construction site next to the school. Silas and a crew of volunteers were building their new home, not a mountain cabin meant for isolation, but a proper house meant for community, with Wide porches for visiting neighbors and extra bedrooms for the family they both hoped to have someday. The foundation stones for that house had been gathered from the mountain where they first met, each rock carefully selected and placed by their own hands. It was honest work, building something lasting from the raw materials of the earth, and it felt like the perfect metaphor for what they were creating together. A life built on solid ground, strong enough to weather any storm. "Mrs. Kane," one of her students called out, "Sheriff Kane is coming up the walk." Sarah's face lit up with the smile that still appeared every time someone mentioned her husband. Even after months of marriage, the simple joy of belonging to someone who loved her completely never failed to warm her heart. Silas entered the schoolhouse with the careful movements of a large man in a small space, removing his hat as he nodded to the children who no longer flinched at his size. "Good afternoon." "Class, Mrs. Kane, might I have a word?" "Children, please continue reading chapter 3 while I speak with the sheriff," Sarah said, moving toward him with the confident steps of someone who had long since memorized every inch of her domain. Outside on the schoolhouse steps, Silas took her hands in his calloused fingers gentle against her smaller ones. "Marshal Harrison sent word from Denver. The appeals for Whitmore and Croft were denied. They'll serve their full sentences." Sarah nodded, feeling a weight she hadn't realized she was still carrying finally lift from her shoulders. "Good. Justice should be final. There's more," Silas continued. "Your Uncle Jake has agreed to testify in 3 more cases involving similar schemes in other territories. The federal government is using our case as a model for rooting out this kind of corruption across the West." The irony wasn't lost on either of them. What had begun as a personal tragedy had become a catalyst for cleaning up corruption that had poisoned communities across the frontier. Their love story had become a tool for justice in ways they never could have imagined. "How do you feel about that?" Sarah asked, studying his face with the intimate knowledge of a wife who could read his expressions through the smallest changes in his voice and breathing. "Proud," he said simply. "Proud that Martha's death wasn't meaningless, that our suffering led to something good, and proud that you had the courage to fight when it would have been easier to stay hidden on the mountain." That evening, they walked together to the small cemetery on the hill overlooking Cedar Falls. Martha's grave was well tended now, marked by a proper headstone that bore not only her name and that of her unborn son, but also the words, "Beloved wife and mother, taken too soon, but never forgotten." Sarah had insisted on visiting Martha's grave regularly, despite, or perhaps because of, the fact that she had never known the woman whose memory had shaped so much of Silas's life. It was her way of honoring the love that had come before, of acknowledging that Martha would always be part of who Silas was. "I brought her these," Sarah said, placing a bouquet of mountain wildflowers on the grave. "From the meadow where you first taught me to identify plants by their scent." Silas stood quietly for a moment, his hand resting on the headstone. The grief was still there. It always would be. But it no longer consumed him. Instead, it had become part of the foundation of his capacity to love, a reminder of how precious and fragile happiness could be. "I think she would have liked you," he said. "Martha always said the measure of a person wasn't in what they could see, but in how clearly they could help others see themselves." As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple, they made their way back, down the hill toward their new home. The house was nearly finished now, its windows glowing warmly in the twilight, smoke rising from the chimney that Silas had built with stones from the same quarry that had provided material for the church. And the school. Inside, the room smelled of fresh-cut pine and the herbs Sarah had hung to dry from the kitchen rafters. The furniture was simple but sturdy, much of it carved by Silas during the long winter evenings when they had planned their return to civilization. Every piece told a story. The rocking chair where Sarah would sit to grade her students' work. The writing desk where Silas handled his correspondence with other lawmen. the kitchen table, where they shared their meals and their dreams, but it was the mantelpiece that drew visitors' attention most. There, displayed with quiet pride, sat 3 artifacts that told the story of their journey. The wooden cross that Silas had carved in his years of exile, now polished and displayed as a symbol of faith restored. Sarah's blue ribbon, framed and mounted as a reminder of the day their lives intersected. And a new addition, the toy horse that Silas had once carved for his unborn son, now waiting for the children they hoped to have together. "Do you ever miss it?" Sarah asked as they sat together by the fire, her head resting on his shoulder. The quiet of the mountain? The solitude? Silas considered the question carefully. The mountain cabin was still there, maintained now as a retreat where they could go when the demands of community life became overwhelming, but it was no longer a prison of solitude or a fortress against the world. "I miss the peace of it sometimes," he said finally, "but I've learned that the best kind of peace doesn't come from being alone. It comes from being exactly where you belong, with exactly the right person." As if to emphasize his point, a knock came at their door. Neighbors stopping by to discuss plans for the harvest festival, or perhaps to ask the sheriff's advice about a minor dispute. In the early days of his return to Cedar Falls, such interruptions had made Silas nervous. Now they filled him with quiet satisfaction. This was what he had been meant for, not isolation, but service, not fear, but connection. Outside, the wind whispered through the cottonwoods that lined their street, carrying with it the sounds of a community at peace. Children played in the gathering dusk, their parents calling them home to supper. Dogs barked in the distance, and somewhere a piano played a gentle melody that drifted through open windows. It was the sound of normalcy, of a life lived in harmony with others rather than in hiding from them. And as Sarah reached for Silas's, hand in the firelight, their wedding rings catching the glow of the flames, both understood that they had found something more precious than safety or solitude. They had found home. Not just a place, but a state of being where 2 people who had been broken by the world had learned to heal each other, one gentle touch at a time, where a blind woman had taught a giant to see himself clearly, and where a man everyone had feared had learned to love without reservation. The legend of the giant mountain man was truly dead now, replaced by something far more powerful and enduring, the reality of 2 people who had chosen love over fear, truth over lies, and connection over isolation. And in the years to come, their story would be told not as a tale of monsters and victims, but as proof that even the most wounded hearts could learn to trust again when they found the right hands to hold them.